"I'll sign it," Sarah Beaumont said, and the pen felt heavier than it had any right to be. Across the table, Marshall Cole watched her with an expression she couldn't read, the way you couldn't read weather until it was already on top of you. Her father wouldn't meet her eyes. Her mother had her hand pressed flat against her own chest, like she was holding her heart in place. The paper between them wasn't a wound. Exactly. It was worse than that. It was a door, and once she walked through it, there would be no walking back. She was 26 years old. 3 days ago, she hadn't known this man's name. Now she was about to become his wife, to keep her family's land out of the bank's hands. If a story like this has ever caught you somewhere in the chest, stay with this one until the end. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Sarah's story is about to travel a long way, and it helps to know how far. The morning the trouble started, Sarah had flour up to her elbows and a loaf rising on the windowsill when her father called her name from the front room. There was a particular flatness to his voice when something was wrong, the same flatness she'd heard the year the creek dried up, the same flatness from the winter they'd had to sell off half the herd just to make it to spring. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to him, and she knew before she even crossed the threshold. Her father, Walter Beaumont, sat at the kitchen table, with his hat turned over in his hands like he was looking for an answer in the brim of it. Her mother, Ruth, stood by the window with her arms wrapped around herself, holding on the way a person holds on when letting go feels like the easier option, and they're refusing to take it. "Sit down, Sarah. I'll stand," she said. "Just say it." Walter exhaled like the breath had been sitting in him for days. "Marshall Cole came to see me yesterday." The name dropped into the room and sat there. Everyone in Pine Hollow knew the name Marshall Cole, not because he was loud about himself. He wasn't. He was the opposite of loud, but because of what he'd built out of nothing. He owned more land than anyone in 3 counties. He ran the largest horse operation west of the river, supplying remounts to half the ranches in the territory, and he did it without ever once setting foot in the saloon, or the church socials, or anywhere people gathered to talk about each other. He kept to himself so completely that people had started inventing reasons for it, the way people do when silence makes them uncomfortable. Some said he'd lost someone once and never recovered. Some said worse things, the kind of things said by people who'd never actually spoken to him and didn't intend to start. He was 36. He had never married. "Why would Marshall Cole come to see you?" Sarah asked slowly. Walter set the hat down on the table, careful, like it was the only steady thing left to him. "We're 3 payments behind on the mortgage, Sarah. The bank's been patient on account of your mother's illness, but patience runs out. Cole's offering to clear the debt, all of it. Pay it off outright today, no waiting. In exchange for what?" Her father's jaw worked. He didn't say it. Her mother said it for him, quiet, like saying it softly might make it hurt less. "In exchange for you." The kitchen went very still. Somewhere outside a rooster called and nobody moved. "He wants to marry me," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. It came out flat, the way her father's voice had come out flat, like the words had simply transferred themselves from his mouth to hers without her permission. "He didn't put it ugly," Walter said quickly, too quickly, the way a man talks when he's trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. He said it plain, said he needed a wife to run his household, and he was willing to pay handsomely for the arrangement, and that he'd heard you were a hard worker and a decent woman, and that he wasn't a man who'd mistreat anybody under his roof. "And if I say no?" Nobody answered that. Nobody had to. If she said no, the bank took the house in 30 days, and her mother, sick, frail, already coughing through the nights, would be put out onto land that wasn't theirs anymore, with nowhere certain to land. Sarah looked at her mother's face and saw the thing her mother was trying so hard to hide, hope, not for herself. For her daughter's choice to be taken away so that her mother wouldn't have to be the reason for it. "I need to think," Sarah said, and went out to the porch where the evening air could not fix anything, but at least it didn't lie to her. She thought about Marshall Cole the way the whole valley thought about him, as a shape more than a man, a name attached to acres and horses, and a silence nobody could account for. She had seen him exactly twice. Once at a distance, riding the fence line on a gray gelding that moved like poured water. Once up close, at the Mercantile, when he'd stepped aside to let her pass through the door first and tipped his hat without a single word, and she'd felt, absurdly, like she'd been seen by something that didn't often bother looking. She thought about the mortgage papers stacked on her father's desk. She thought about her mother's cough, wet and tearing, worse every week. She thought about the particular kind of poverty that wasn't about money so much as about choices running out one by one until there was only one road left and you had to walk it whether you wanted to or not. By morning, she had her answer. The wedding happened 11 days later in the front parlor of the Cole Ranch house, with a circuit preacher who'd ridden 2 days to get there, and a handful of witnesses who were mostly Marshall's hired hands standing awkwardly along the wall in their cleanest shirts. Sarah wore her mother's dress, taken in at the waist. Marshall wore a black coat that fit him like it had been made for someone slightly less broad in the shoulder, and she would learn later that it had been his father's, the only formal coat he owned, kept folded in a trunk for exactly this kind of occasion, and no other. He didn't smile through the ceremony, neither did she. But when the preacher told him he could kiss his bride, Marshall hesitated, just barely, just long enough for her to notice, and then pressed the lightest, most careful kiss to her cheek instead of her mouth, like he understood that anything more would have been a theft rather than a gift. It was such a small mercy that it nearly undid her composure entirely. The first weeks were an education in silence. Marshall Cole did not talk unless talking served a purpose. He rose before dawn and was out among the horses before she woke, and he came back in for supper smelling of hay and leather and cold morning air, and he ate without much conversation. And most nights he retired to the small study off the kitchen, and stayed there with ledgers and lamplight until long after she'd gone to bed. He had given her the run of the house, every room, every key, full authority over the kitchen, and the linens and the hired girl, who came twice a week to help with the heavier washing, and then he had, in effect, disappeared into his own life and left her alone in the middle of it. She told herself she preferred it that way. A man who left her alone could not hurt her. But there was a particular loneliness to being a wife in a house where her husband barely looked at her, and some nights she lay awake in the bedroom that had been given to her. Her own room, a fact she noted with a complicated mixture of relief, and something that felt unsettlingly close to disappointment, and listened to the wind move through the cottonwoods outside, and wondered exactly what kind of life she'd traded her name for. "If I'm running this household," she told him one evening the third week, setting his plate down with more force than necessary, "I intend to run it properly. That means I need to know how you take your coffee, what you can't abide eating, and whether you've got any objection to me rearranging the pantry, because right now it's organized like a man who's never once had to find anything in it." Marshall looked up from his plate, and for the first time since the wedding, something that might almost have been amusement crossed his face. "Black," he said. "No objection to anything you abide eating. And the pantry's been needing a woman's sense for longer than I care to admit." It wasn't much, but it was the first full sentence he'd offered her that wasn't strictly necessary, and she found herself turning it over in her mind long after the dishes were done. Small things, after that. He started leaving wildflowers on the kitchen table some mornings before he left for the barns. Never with comment, never acknowledged afterward, just there, like weather, like something that simply occurred. When her mother's condition worsened, and word came by way of a neighbor, Marshall didn't ask permission or make her explain herself. He simply hitched the wagon and drove her the 11 miles to her parents' place himself, and waited outside without being asked, for as long as she needed, and drove her back in silence that somehow didn't feel empty the way it once had. She learned, in pieces, the way you learn a country by walking it rather than reading about it. She learned which of his hired men had wives and children on the outer parcels of land, and that Marshall paid every one of them above the going wage without making a show of it, because, as one of the older hands told her, almost embarrassed to be saying it, "Mr. Cole figures a man works better when his family ain't going hungry, and he don't see the need to make a man grateful out loud for what's only fair to begin with." She learned that the silence wasn't coldness. It was carefulness. Marshall Cole had been raised by a father who ran through 2 wives and a fortune on charm and big talk and empty promises, and had watched, as a boy, exactly what that kind of man cost the people who trusted him. He had decided, somewhere in that watching, that he would rather be thought distant than be the kind of man whose words outran his actions. He told her this only once, late on an evening in early autumn, the two of them sitting on the porch steps after a long day, not because she'd asked, but because the quiet between them had become comfortable enough that filling it felt natural rather than forced. "My father used to promise things easy," he said, looking out at the dark line of the horizon rather than at her. "Promised my mother the moon and gave her debt instead. I figured young that I'd rather a man know exactly what to expect of me, even if what to expect was quiet, than have him hoping for things I couldn't deliver." "And what should I expect of you?" Sarah asked. He considered it for a long moment, the way he considered most things, like a man counting fence posts before committing to a number. "That I won't lie to you, that I won't raise a hand to you or let any man under my roof do so, that whatever's mine you've got a claim to, same as me, and that I'll work this land till there's nothing left in me to work it with, before I let you or your family go without." It wasn't romance, not the way the songs described it, but it landed somewhere in her chest harder than any song ever had, because she understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that he meant every single word of it as a binding promise, rather than a pretty sentiment. The trouble, when it came from the town rather than the marriage. Pine Hollow had never quite known what to make of Marshall Cole, and a sudden marriage to a Beaumont girl gave the gossiping tongues new fuel. Word traveled, the way it always did in small places, that the Beaumonts had been bought out of their debt, that Sarah had been sold like livestock, that Cole had simply purchased himself a wife the same way he purchased breeding stock, for utility and nothing more. The kinder version of the rumor painted Sarah as a victim. The crueler version painted her as a woman who'd traded her dignity for solvency and ought to be ashamed of herself either way. She bore it as best she could until the day Constance Whitfield— no, that wasn't right. A different name, a town woman, sharp-tongued and well-practiced at it, cornered her outside the mercantile and said, just loud enough for half the street to hear, that everyone knew what kind of arrangement the Coles had, and that Sarah needn't pretend it was anything but money-changing hands for a body in a man's bed. Sarah felt her face go hot, felt the old instinct to shrink rise up in her, and then, surprising herself, felt something else entirely take its place. "My husband," she said, clear enough that the whole street could hear it if it wanted to, "has never once raised his voice to me, never once gone back on a single thing he's promised, and works harder for the people under his care than any man in this town has the stomach to. If that's a scandal to you, I'd ask what exactly you're measuring him against, because by my count, he comes out ahead of most husbands in Pine Hollow, including, I imagine, your own." She walked away with her chin up and her hands shaking, and didn't tell Marshall about it that night, though somehow, through the particular machinery by which small towns communicate everything to everyone eventually, he heard anyway, and the next morning he said nothing about it at all except to set down, beside her coffee, a small parcel wrapped in brown paper that turned out to contain a fine pair of leather gloves she'd admired once, weeks before, in the mercantile window, and never mentioned wanting. It was the closest thing to a thank you he knew how to give, and she understood it perfectly. Real trouble arrived in November, in the shape of a man named Harlow Briggs, a banker's son with more ambition than character, who had wanted the coal land for himself for years, and had never forgiven Marshall for outbidding him on it a decade earlier. Briggs had connections at the county courthouse, and a grudge that had only deepened with age, and when he learned that Marshall's original land grant carried an old, badly worded clause about water rights along the eastern boundary, he saw his opening. The lawsuit landed on a Tuesday. Briggs claimed the water rights, and by extension a significant strip of grazing land had never been properly transferred when Marshall's father sold the parcel decades before, and that the original error meant the land, by law, reverted to the Briggs family estate. It was, Sarah understood almost immediately, an attack built on a technicality rather than truth, but technicalities had a way of winning in courtrooms regardless of truth, especially when the other side had money enough to keep lawyers arguing long after the facts had been exhausted. Marshall took the news the way he took most things, quietly, his jaw tightening, his hands going still on the table in a way that told her more than any outburst could have. "If he wins this," he said, "it isn't just the water. It's every horse on that side of the property without source to drink from come summer. It's near half the herd. Then we fight it," Sarah said. "We," he repeated, and there was something in the way he said the word, testing it, like he hadn't expected to hear it applied to himself in a long while. "We," she said firmly. "I didn't marry into half a partnership, Marshall. I'm not interested in sitting in the parlor while you lose the ranch to a man with a grudge and a law degree. It was, she would think later, the moment the marriage became something neither of them had quite planned for. Not love, exactly, not yet, but a kind of alliance that ran deeper than the paper they'd signed. A shared determination that turned out to be its own kind of intimacy. She spent the next 6 weeks doing things she'd never imagined a rancher's wife doing. She rode with Marshall to the county courthouse and sat through tedious hours of records, helping him search through old land surveys and water use documentation in a dusty archive room that smelled of must and candle wax. She wrote letters, careful, precise letters, to 2 of Marshall's neighbors whose own water rights bordered the disputed land, asking them to testify to decades of established use, because established use, the lawyer Marshall hired finally explained, might carry more weight than the original paperwork's ambiguity. She discovered, in the course of it, that she had a mind for detail that Marshall lacked patience for, and Marshall discovered that his quiet competence with people, the same quiet competence that made his hired hands fiercely loyal to him, extended further than he'd ever tested it, once he had a reason worth testing it for. The night before the hearing, neither of them could sleep. Sarah found Marshall on the porch, staring out at land that might not be his much longer, and she sat beside him without a word, the way their silences had become a kind of language between them. "If we lose this," he said finally, "I want you to know none of it changes what I told you in the fall. Whatever's left, you've still got a claim to it. I won't have you thinking different." "We're not going to lose," Sarah said. "You sound certain." "I am." She looked at him then, really looked, the way she hadn't quite let herself look in the early weeks of their strange arrangement. "Because I've watched you build something honest out of nothing, Marshall Cole, while a man like Harlow Briggs has spent his whole life trying to take what other people built. The law doesn't always get that right immediately, but the truth has a way of holding up if you give it room to." He looked back at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes that she couldn't entirely name, and then, very carefully, the way he did everything, he reached over and took her hand in his. Not a grand gesture, not the kind the songs described, just warm and steady and entirely sure, and held it until the cold drove them both inside. The hearing lasted 3 days. Briggs's lawyer was sharp, expensive, and thoroughly unprepared for the sheer volume of evidence Sarah had helped assemble. Decades of water use records, sworn statements from 3 separate neighboring ranches, even a surviving letter from Marshall's grandfather establishing the boundary intent in language too plain to argue with. On the final afternoon, the judge ruled in Marshall's favor, finding the original clause ambiguous but the established history of use, occupation, and neighborly agreement decisive. Harlow Briggs left the courthouse red-faced and silent. Marshall Cole left it with his wife's hand resting in the crook of his arm. In front of the entire town, that had spent a season speculating about the nature of their marriage, and he didn't say a single word about it. Didn't need to. The picture said everything that needed saying. That night, back at the ranch, with the threat finally lifted and the house quiet around them, Marshall found her in the kitchen, finishing the last of the dishes by lamplight, and stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I'd rather say it plain than pretty, because plain is the only way I know how to say things that matter." She set down the towel and waited. "I married you to save my land and yours both, and I told myself that was the whole of it, because that was easier to carry than the truth." He paused, and for the first time since she'd known him, she watched Marshall Cole search for words like a man genuinely certain he could find the right ones. "The truth is you became something I didn't know I was missing, Sarah. Not the wife I arranged for. The wife I'd have chosen, if choosing had ever been on the table for a man like me." She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him, close enough now that the careful distance they'd kept for months felt suddenly, gloriously unnecessary. "It was always on the table," she said softly. "You just never asked." "I'm asking now," he said. "Not for the marriage. We've got that already, paper and all. I'm asking if you'll have me, truly have me, the way a woman has a man she's chosen and not just settled for. I chose you the day you stood outside that house and waited for me without asking why I needed waiting for," she said. "I just hadn't told you yet." This time, when he kissed her, it wasn't careful at all. The seasons turned the way seasons do, indifferent to the dramas of the people living through them. The water still ran where it had always run. The horses still grazed the disputed land that was no longer disputed. The hired hands still worked, still went home to families who never went hungry, still spoke of Mr. and Mrs. Cole with a particular respect, reserved for people who'd proven themselves honest under pressure. And in the spring, when Ruth Beaumont's health finally turned for the better, helped along, everyone privately understood, by the steady stream of support that flowed quietly from the Cole ranch without ever once being called charity. Sarah stood on the porch of the house that had once felt like a sentence, and now felt unmistakably like home, and watched her husband ride in from the eastern pasture. The same gray gelding moving like poured water beneath him, and felt something settle in her chest that no contract, no arrangement, no desperate bargain could ever have promised her. It had started as a debt paid in her name. It had become, somewhere in the quiet accumulation of small kindnesses and shared battles and careful honest words, the truest thing she had ever known.